Okay, now we are going to begin the 4th chapter in the Sapolsky book. And this chapter begins describing the digestive system, and then we will be moving on to what the sympathetic nervous system activation does to this particular system. And also, when the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, what can then happen? So, starting with our notes here, we are going to come up and begin our slideshow from the beginning and basically talk about how digestion is important for putting energy in the bank, the human bank, your body bank, okay? And so digestion is, as Sapolsky describes it in his very unique way, breaking down chunks of animals and vegetables so that they can be transformed into chunks of human. Very interesting way to put it. Not extremely appetizing to me when I think of it that way, but bottom line is we are taking external sources, working with it physiologically until we can utilize those sources as building blocks and as energy. This process is basically accomplished in large part by enzymes in the saliva and throughout the digestive tract, and by acid that's being released in the stomach. And again, it's important to remember that acid is not released along the entire tract. The stomach is especially set up for that, and we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Through digestion, complex food is broken into its simplest parts, molecules, including first, amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, very important. Simple sugars, remember we're breaking these down to later be built back into something, okay? Simple sugars, glucose, sucrose, fructose, the building blocks, these are, of complex sugars and carbohydrates, which starches, glycogen. Also, free fatty acids and glycerol, which are the constituents of fat, triglycerides. You hear a lot about triglycerides. So we need to break all of these external sources down. As we move on, let's talk real quickly the digestive tract. Again, Sapolsky really hits a unique way of describing the fact that the digestive tract is a tubular tract that runs from the mouth to the anus. Maybe you've never thought about it exactly like that. So that's Sapolsky for you. What is inside it does need to be absorbed or somewhat and somehow transported into the body. Mucus is secreted along pretty much the whole length of the digestive tract to help protect the lining of the digestive tract and to facilitate food passage. In other words, food and as it gets broken down will slide more readily. And again, mucus is one of those words that sounds like what it is. I don't know if you ever thought about it, but I do. Okay, let's look at the components of the digestive tract. You're like, I know these components. You probably do. Let's list them anyway and just talk very briefly about a process that is accomplished in each one of them. And the first is the mouth. You put things in your mouth. Not only do you chew, but you have an enzyme called alpha amylase. So salivary alpha amylase actually begins the digestion of carbohydrates. There's the mechanical process of chewing, which is called mastication. I don't have that written here. try to get that up there somewhere for you, but mastication is the process of chewing. So we have the chemical breakdown and we have the mechanical breakdown. Now, next, the stomach comes along, and there is acid within the stomach, which is protected by a special layer of walls and mucus to help protect it from the acid. Here we see the conversion of pepsinogen, which is inactive, to pepsin, which is active, and that promotes digestion of proteins. Other digestive enzymes and mechanical action, kind of smooshing around, will help break up the food. Next, going through, like I said, just very quickly, a list of these so that when we go back and talk about them individually, we're all on exactly the same page. The small intestine, the duodenum, is basically the top 12 finger widths. So if you took these and added another hand here, that length of your small intestine is referred to as the duodenum. That'll be important when we talk about ulcers, because you've probably heard of duodenal ulcers. Somebody once in a while might say duodenum, so it's the same thing. This is, as I mentioned, the site of most ulcers. There are a couple of biochemicals that are released in here. The one is called chyme and one is bile. When you hear bile, you think of the green bile, and it's produced from the liver. And it actually, the small intestine actually receives about 1/4 of bile per day from the liver. That's a fair amount. It also, the small intestine, receives pancreatic juice, which contains enzymes to digest all 3 types of food. And also, it receives lots of bicarbonate ion to neutralize the acid that was released by the stomach. And now we don't want that acid coming down and making contact with the walls inside of the small intestine or farther down. Also, there is the secretion of CCK, or cholestyrocytokinin, by the small intestine, which actually helps inhibit the emptying of your stomach. And as long as your stomach is still got food in it, has something in it, it's got contents, that makes you feel hypothetically satisfied, full, and not still hungry. This happens to contribute to the sense of satiety. And there is movement. We talk a lot about the chemicals, the biochemicals, and how those are breaking things down. But throughout, there's always some form of movement that also provides some mechanical action to contribute to that breakdown. And we call the movement within the small intestine peristalsis. And it's kind of like a snake dance is how it's been referred to. And so that will help promote moving the contents along and helping it to be in a situation where they can be absorbed and they can be moved on depending on what the circumstance and the need is. So now we're down to the large intestine, the colon, which its primary purpose is to reabsorb water. Remember the kidney and how there were sodium pumps that actively pumped sodium across the walls, and then chloride with the negative, a negative ion follows, and then water will follow passively. It's that same idea exactly. And you really want that to happen. And this is one of the reasons that if food moves through too quickly and your body, your colon doesn't have enough time to accomplish this reabsorption of excess water, you will end up with diarrhea. Talk more about that in a few minutes. You're like, oh, yay. Anyway, the large intestine is primarily concerned with, as Sapolsky said, propulsion. That's a very, I think, descriptive term. And the absorption of sodium, water, and defecation, getting everything out. So propelling things along and then eliminating through defecation. The sphincters that are found throughout the digestive tract are really important. They are circular muscles at the beginning and end of each organ. And they kind of lock, squeeze tight to prevent food from moving to that next step too quickly. So that's a very brief, but I think sufficient overview of the digestive tract, the digestive system, and some of the basic things that are happening, the basic processes that are happening in each area. So we're going to move along a little bit more and talk about the construction that we need. And again, I am borrowing these terms from Sapolsky. And I did that to keep everything as parallel with what he's describing in his language, that it's easily, connected, the book and my notes. But besides that, there's such cool ways of describing what's going on. And he says the digestive system is involved with the task of construction. And as he puts it, like converting cash into stocks, bonds, and Swiss bank accounts. In other words, you're not going to spend everything right away. You are going to convert your intake into something that can be stored, and later on, you can have access to it. Insulin, which is released from the pancreas, created and released by the pancreas, is essential for the transport and storage of fatty acids into fat cells, and importantly, glucose and amino acids into other cells. Purposes of this course, that's enough. Insulin is released by, pay attention here, because it's not released by sympathetic nervous system endings or release neurotransmitters or hormones. It is released by parasympathetic stimulation before, during, and after a meal. We'll be coming back and referring to some of these concepts shortly. Okay, so now we've got everything set up, and let's say that we've got our whole digestive system working efficiently, doing its job. And during a stressor, there's going to be some changes, and by now you should be thinking ahead and going, yeah, let's see what's happening, and what's not going to happen is storage, right? You're not going to be storing more because you need it now. So if you increase the sympathetic nervous tone, which is what happens during a stressor, and decrease that parasympathetic activity, you are going to have the following occur. Glucocorticoids are released from the adrenal gland, the cortex, again, that outer part of the adrenal gland. Glucagon from the pancreas. Epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. So if you have those adrenal glands, the inner part is the medulla, and that is where you will find the epinephrine and what will be releasing the epinephrine. Norepinephrine will be released from the sympathetic nerve endings throughout the system and a bit from the adrenal medulla, a little bit. So remember, that should start making sense. I'm going to repeat and include these areas and these organs and neurohormones enough that hopefully they become kind of second nature. You know exactly what I'm talking about right away. And sympathetic nervous stimulation will block the transport of nutrients into cells. It actually counteracts insulin. Again, why? Purposefully, to make sure that you're not storing sources of energy that you need to escape from your bear. And sympathetic nervous system stimulation will promote the conversion of triglycerides from fatty acids and glycerol, glycogen to glucose, and protein in the non-exercising muscle to amino acids. Exercising muscles have a local override, interestingly, that can grab nutrients from the circulation, and this is very important. The mechanism pretty much includes an increase in vasodilation, so there's more vasodilation opening up of the blood vessels. And that is due to breakdown products that are being released because of metabolic processes, okay? Hopefully that all made sense. If it doesn't, make sure you ask questions on a discussion post and read the book. We also have gluconeogenesis in the liver that happens. That, if think about it, glucose, new, genesis, creation of in the liver. Now, we don't want to be worried about spending energy for that. So if you keep producing glucose and you're using that energy, Sapolsky equates it to basically chopping up your furniture to burn in a fireplace to stay warm. Eventually, you're going to run out of furniture. Also, glycerol from those triglycerides can be converted into glucose. So what we need is to make sure that we continue to have access to enough of the stored products that we can convert to emergency energy. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. So the question is, why do we then get sick, or why is it likely that we'll get sick as this stressor, which activates the sympathetic nervous system, which then starts affecting the digestion this way, says, okay, let's not digest anymore. And let's just start breaking down things as much as we can to help us get through this. Sapolsky used the analogy of paying a penalty for withdrawing from a high interest savings account. Some of you may have found it necessary to do that. You also found, if you did that, that you lose a lot of the resources that you initially had in penalties because you're pulling them out sooner than you should or more than you should. So if you take that concept and you apply that to your physiology, this whole process is basically going to mean that ultimately you're going to tire more readily. Usually it's not a whole big problem. It's not a huge problem. However, at certain points, it's possible that it can lead to some issues. An example is sometimes glucocorticoids, steroids, are given to a patient to help control a disease. It can be something like leukemia, edema, it can be sometimes a neurological disorder, and so on. If that happens, eventually steroid myopathy can occur. This is kind of like a huge amount of a stressor and making this much of your own cortisol, essentially, and other glucocorticoids be released. It's simulating that. Now, you're not doing it when you're being administered these glucocorticoids. You're not doing it to yourself, but your body is still saying, wow, lots of glucocorticoids out there. And eventually you can have breakdown because of that. Not only could you tire more readily, the myo, which is muscle tissue, can dry up a little bit. The muscle tissue can start to degrade. Also, there is an increase in diabetes mellitus. It is a huge problem in our society today. We are seeing so much more diabetes. But first, let's take a look at the two types. Type 1 is juvenile diabetes. However, just because it says juvenile doesn't mean its onset can't be a little later. But in this particular form of diabetes, you basically have an autoimmune attack on cells in your pancreas. And these cells happen to be those that secrete insulin, beta cells. Therefore, if you don't have the insulin you need, remember how important insulin was for transporting things like amino acids and fatty acids into cells, and also getting glucose into a cell where it's needed. But these fatty acids, because they're not getting transported into the cells, can end up gumming up the blood vessels, getting gummy, inside the blood vessels. Not good. And that in turn can result in kidney problems, atherosclerotic plaques, as we talked about in chapter 3, little strokes in the tissues where the plaques occur, and it can contribute to cataracts in the eyes. So all of these things are definitely damaging to the body. You need to treat this type 1 diabetes with injections of insulin because your body just isn't making it. And too much insulin will result in storing too many nutrients and deprives the brain of glucose. So that's why your levels of glucose, insulin, and things have to be monitored so precisely. Now, type 2, which is very often considered to be adult onset diabetes, is different. Unfortunately, we now currently are seeing a lot of kids, 12 years old or so, developing type 2 diabetes. And in this form of diabetes, cells cannot respond to insulin. It's not that you don't have insulin, your cells just aren't responding appropriately. So they're not taking in what they need. There's not the transportation, the transport of fatty acids and amino acids and glucose into the cells appropriately. This is considered to be non-insulin dependent. And so occasionally you might need to start using insulin because of secondary factors, but there are other forms of medication, which again, I'm not going to take the time to address right now in this lecture. But one of the things that happens is things like fat cells get full and you can't get the transport, and ultimately you get tired because you're not using energy in the same way. So that also increases fatigue. And basically, a lot of it can be down regulation of these cells. Now, very often they talk about underactivity and being overweight as being primary factors in the development of type 2 diabetes. However, that does not mean that all people with type 2 diabetes suffer from inactivity or obesity. Okay, so it can occur. Again, the excess circulating fatty acids, remember, they can't get into the cells because the cells, fat cells, are not responding to the insulin that is actually being released. And again, we have that gumming up of blood vessels, the kidneys, and the eyes. Okay, now glucocorticoids, cortisol, I'm going to sometimes say cortisol is the primary human glucocorticoid, epinephrine, and norepinephrine actually all, this is important here, make fat cells less sensitive to insulin. So, oh man, we might have some downregulation and we got these fat cells and the insulin is just like knocking at the door like, let me help get these into you, and the fat cells are just not listening, not paying attention. They're not going to answer the door and allow any of these products to enter. Okay, now that's one thing that can happen after a stressor. Okay, now we're talking about during the stressor, and I think you can figure out how this can down the road, if it's prolonged, cause all kinds of chaos. But after a stressor, tissues can regain sensitivity at different rates. And this is becoming more obvious as research is being done, and it is sometimes just the fact that tissues and organs turn back on at different rates after the conclusion of a stressor that can lead to problems, that could lead to illness. There seems to be a genetic predisposition to type 1 diabetes, and also to some degree, a little bit, type 2 diabetes. I think sometimes people overlook that genetic predisposition. I know in some families, you have lots of people who end up with this type 2 diabetes, and even if the individuals in the family do not have a history of obesity and tend to be typically active adults. So diabetes basically doubles mortality. It triples heart disease in men specifically, and actually is one of, if not the leading cause of blindness in adults. I want to make sure I say adults. Again, here is a statistic for you. Is it possible it's not exactly right every day for every area? Yes, but this should show you that it's pretty common. And I honestly would at this point in time guesstimate that it's even higher than 15%. And so here is a little diagram that just shows you some of these digestive organs that I talked about. You can follow through. A couple of things, those salivary glands you see there have to be activated and working to release the saliva into the mouth. And you see the esophagus, which connects the mouth down to the stomach. And this esophagus can become eroded very quickly if you have a problem where there's excessive acid release into into your stomach, and it is not held tightly down there by the sphincter, and it can move back up into the esophagus. Remember, the esophagus does not have the same kind of lining that the stomach does to protect it from this acid. So there's really a follow-up lecture to kind of conclude digestive system issues and things that happen during the stress response. I'm being fairly basic with this particular thing, this particular system right now, but I think it's very clear that stressors, especially chronic and extreme stressors, can alter the digestive processes, all of them. And things such as diabetes certainly can begin to complicate health in other ways throughout the entire body. So we'll be picking up a little bit of that next time. This was hopefully a little shorter, very accessible lecture for you. And again, hopefully you're starting to see a little pattern here about turning things on, turning things off, and the implications of those processes. So